Okay, so to create my sketch, what I did was I decided also on the size that I'm going to put around the outside edges of my mat too. So while I'm putting 1.5 is the measurement that's going to split the photos between the ones that are side by side, and I'm going to split the 2 rows with a 2-inch measurement. I decided that because it's a bigger collection of artworks, I'm going to do a thicker mat around the outside. And I would probably recommend the same thing for you, whether you're matting 2 together or 3 or more. I would recommend going with a thicker width and height than our normal 2 inches on the sides top and then 2.5 on the bottom. And so I decided I'm going to go with 3 on each side, 3 on the top, and then I'm going to do 3.5 on the bottom, always to give it that little extra weight on the bottom as well. So now that I have that determined, okay, I'm going to zoom in a little bit for you so you can see my actual sketching. And then as I sketch, I'm just going to kind of refer to each measurement, like where that's taking place as I'm working on the sketch. So the next step of the process for me is creating a sketch. And so I quickly just sketched out kind of like a thumbnail of how I envision the prints being laid out within the map board. So 2 rows of 3 across. And so I also wrote down the measurements of like the dividers, the tops and sides, and the bottom, and then the artworks. So again, when I measured the artworks, I ended up leaving myself a little space around the edges. And I decided that I wanted the windows to all be the same. So I'm going to leave the height at 5 inches, so I have a little bit of space at the top and a little bit of space at the bottom. And then I decided that the width of each image would be 7.5, and so that would give me a little bit of space at the left and at the right around these transfers. So that works really nice with these transfers because the edges are interesting. That would also probably work well with prints, but there may be artworks where you don't want to see the edges, in which case I would suggest that you subtract a little bit, probably about 1/4 of an inch to the height and the width, because that way when you cut the window, it will be a little bit smaller than the artwork, which could work out really well when you're cutting your mat. The Logan mat cutter that we're using for this process is a little bit more precise at cutting exactly on the edge where you need it to be cut, as opposed to the other mat makers that we have in the room where you can use those 4 different settings on the mat maker to make it so that way your window crops in a little bit more and the artwork ends up being just cropped a little bit on the edges, and so you never end up with a window that's too big for your artwork. So you do have to be really precise about your measurements with the Logan. And so I made the choice that I want to show the edges of these transfers. Okay, so now that I have my sketch and I have all of my measurements that I'm going to be placing in, I'm going to place those measurements into my sketch. And so I know that the height of all of these horizontal photographs is going to be 5 inches. And so I just put a 5 on the inside here and here. And this is going to help me determine the overall height of the window mat. Okay, now I know that the top here, I'm going to add 3 inches. I know that between here, I'm going to add 2 inches. And then I know at the bottom, I'm adding 3.5. Okay, and so for the height of my overall window mat, I'm going to add all of these measurements. So I've got 8, 9, 10, 15, 16, 17, 18.5 is going to be the height. Now I'm going to do the same thing for the width. So I know that each of these artworks across is going to be 7.5 inches. I know that the left, I want to have 3 inches. I know that the vertical dividers, I'm having them be smaller than this horizontal divider. And so they are going to be 1.5 inches each. And so if I go ahead and fill this in, it helps me to keep track of making sure that I have all of the measurements added. Now I know that I'm going to have 3 inches on the right as well. And so what I will do is I will add all of these horizontal measurements together. And so the width of the piece is going to be 31 and a half inches. Okay, so I put 0.5. You just remember that you always have to think in fractions because you're measuring with a ruler. So I know that 0.5 is a half of an inch, but just make sure that you're always working with a fraction that makes sense for the fractions that are on the ruler. And so while I'm writing in decimal points, that may not be the best thing for you, but I'm looking at half inches. So that's the way that I did it. Okay, so again, I'm plotting out the vertical measurements and then I'm plotting out the horizontal measurements and then adding them to get the height of the overall map board and the width of the overall map board. So if you're not good with a ruler and measuring your artwork, you can always check in with me and have me check your measurements. And then I always like to check your math too. And you can always run by me like what you're thinking of as far as spacing out your pieces. I'm always here for you to help you with that. But at least this will give you a general idea of what you want to look to do when you are mapping out the piece and figuring out your measurements for your overall height and width of your map board, and then also for the placement of the windows where your pieces will be shown. Okay, so moving along, in the next video, I'm going to show you how to measure this all out on the back of a map board, and then later on I'll be showing you how to cut the actual window mat and then place the work in it.